So this morning's program provided historical context and background for understanding the Camptowns in South Korea, how they developed, and the people who were part of those Camptowns. This afternoon's program will turn to the mixed race offspring or children of the Camptowns. We'll look at the lives of these children in photography and follow them on their journey overseas as adoptees. So our first presenter this afternoon is Eleana Kim. Professor Kim is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of Adopted Territory, Transnational Korean Adoptees, and the Politics of Belonging, which is a fantastic book. This book, which is an ethnographic study of a global network of adults adopted from Korea and their returns to South Korea, received the James B. Pillay Prize from the Association of Asian Studies and the Social Science Book Award from the Association of Asian American Studies. Professor Kim's talk today is entitled Understanding Adoptions from South Korea to the U.S., How an Emergency Situation Turned into a Permanent Solution. Please welcome Eleana Kim.
Hi, everyone. I have two computers, so I don't know how this is going to work exactly, but I'm really honored to be here, truly. I thought the morning session was incredible, and I thought I would, I think because of the nature of the event, it's important to know where people come from, as was very eloquently stated earlier. So I just wanted to say a little bit about myself very briefly, which is, to sort of position where I'm coming from. I'm Korean American. I was actually born in Canada, and any other Canadians? Okay. And both my parents are actually from the northern part of Korea, so they fled south right before the war, and they were refugees in South Korea. And through interactions with Canadian missionaries, they ended up in Canada, and that's the sort of prehistory to my own life. And I became interested in adoptions from South Korea when I was in graduate school in the late 1990s. And I think I've told this story a few times already, but a large part of what piqued my interest was that I started to see things kind of in the periphery of my life in New York City, that, whether it was a video produced by a transnational Korean adopted person, or the sort of emergence of these large conferences like the Cannes conference, which some of you may know about. And when I saw this information, I was just kind of shocked that, first of all, by the numbers, which at that time people were saying like 110 to 150,000 children adopted from South Korea since the end of the Korean War. And that number alone just totally kind of blew me away. And I had thought of myself up until that moment as a pretty well-informed, sort of politically progressive Korean American person. I was like, how did I not know about this massive migration of children? So that really became the start of my explorations. And from there, I just started to meet, dozens and dozens of adoptees, some of whom have become, among my closest friends. So, for me also, it was a really transformative experience to do the research. But, as I'll discuss, even as I was doing this research, the first generations of mixed-race Korean adoptees were part of some of these scenes, and some of you who are here today are also major figures in the Korean adoptee world. But nevertheless, I do think that this conference is really historic because we simply don't know enough about that history. So I want to echo Suji's comments from earlier, which is to say, you are the experts in the room, and that there's so much more to learn. So I think that my presence here is really just a very small sort of attempt to help start a conversation, which I think will hopefully continue to evolve and to contribute to just a wider understanding of what this really transnational history is all about. Okay, so what I'm going to present today is a kind of overview of adoption from South Korea, and we've heard some of the details of this in other presentations, but I wanted to offer a few more details from various archival sources. And these include newspaper articles, magazine articles, government documents. There's an amazing archive at the University of Minnesota called the Social Welfare History Archive. Letters that were exchanged between American parents and South Korean officials in the 1950s and 60s. And, you know, we've heard some scholars' names throughout some of the presentations, and, you know, like whether it's Arissa Oh, who has a new book on the history of Korean adoption, Grace Cho's work, Suji's work. There's Taejin Hwang, who's here, who's doing amazing work on Camptowns and militarization. Catherine Moon, who's also been mentioned multiple times for her work with the Kichichon, or Camptown military prostitution. So as these names circulate, I think we can see that there's a kind of like historical canon emerging, or literature that we can sort of turn to, which I think is really important. And of course, we need to include Mr. Lee's amazing documentary work, you know, that is providing really crucial information from the South Korean side. So, but as we sort of start to come to some understanding of what this history might be about, I also want to be really cognizant of all the ways in which this, you know, is a transnational history that's really informed by deeply human stories. And those stories, you know, will always exceed the bounds of what we think we know. So, you know, even as we're trying to sort of get closer to maybe the truth about the past, to always remember that it'll be much more complicated than what we can truly comprehend. Okay, so a lot of prefaces. The last preface is on terminology. So I'll be using words like mixed race. I liked Suji's word mixedness, and as has been mentioned, a lot of the mixed race children were referred to as GI babies. They were also referred to as UN babies because they were not only military, American military in South Korea. The terminology of the day was mixed blood, which for various reasons is not really acceptable. And in Korean, in the 50s and 60s, and even today, people refer to mixed or biracial Koreans as 혼혈, which means mixed blood, literally. After the passage of the Amerasian Act, and we learned from Suji that the term was coined by Pearl S. Buck, Amerasian has been common, and I really love the idea of a pan-Amerasian identity and sort of taking that word and politicizing it. So that's something I'd love to sort of keep an eye on. But I'll be using mostly mixed or mixed race in this talk. And then there's the opposite term, which is often full Korean, which is also very problematic. But in the absence of another option, you'll hear me say full Korean, but remember it's kind of in quotes, scare quotes. Okay, so let's, oh, it's not even up there. Oh, okay. Do I need to do anything? There you go. Okay. Okay, great. So, okay. So, does anyone recognize this image? It's good. Because, you know, even up till like, I don't know, 20 years ago, a lot of people are like, oh, I know exactly who that is. This is Colonel Dean Hess, an American priest turned fighter pilot who served in the Korean War. And he had been credited with saving 1,000 Korean children from the fall of Seoul in 1950. It was called Operation Baby Lift, and he airlifted 1,000 children to safety in Jeju Island. He wrote a memoir that was made into a Hollywood film called Battle Hymn in 1956, and that film actually has screened in South Korea, I think annually, maybe even up until the present. So, you know, the image that he projects here is one of kind of the Great White Hope, right? And he has saved these children who have books and they're able to be educated, while in the background, I don't know if you can tell, you have the sort of faceless refugees, mostly adult Koreans fleeing. So the notion of him having saved these children is very strongly presented in this image. Actually, in fact, though there's a former military person and historian in Washington State, I don't know if he's still alive, but George Drake, some of you may know him, he discovered that the actual person behind the airlift and the saving of all these children was Army Chaplain Russell Blaisdell. So Dean Hess took credit, got a lot of notoriety, fame and even fortune from this, when it was Russell Blaisdell. So this story was, in fact, too good to be true, but it was very powerful and was able to fool many people who sorely needed a story of heroism for a war that was hard to comprehend. Coming on the heels of World War II, the so-called Good War, the Korean War was the first military theater of the Cold War, and few people knew where Korea was or its history of colonialism under the Japanese. It was a complex civil war in which good guys and bad guys were difficult to tell apart, and in which racisms and xenophobias were heightened. In this confusing context, US soldiers were drawn to the Korean waifs of war, and these are images taken from US newspapers in the around 1950. And these waifs of war helped them to make sense of a senseless situation. Visually, we can see how the children are depicted, especially in this image, as supporting characters to the main character of the American war hero, who, as I mentioned before, has kind of given opportunities not just for survival, but for education and a future for these children. Images like this one helped Americans to understand the war as a just war, and it reproduced other such images of actual soldiers who frequently petitioned Americans back home to send monetary or material donations. And there are a lot of operations around this time where women were knitting blankets, sending clothes. A lot of this because, as Grace mentioned earlier, because individual soldiers and even the U.S. military as a whole was asking for people to send what they could. And there's some figure, I believe it's in O's book, of like a figure in the millions in terms of aid provided by American citizens in this way. So in this image, the quotation here is really kind of pointing out how Korean children were able to help soldiers, as I said before, make sense out of a senseless situation. And then some of these American soldiers even brought children home as military mascots. Military mascots became attached to battalions and were oftentimes living among them. They were houseboys or they ran small errands. They also would be fictively adopted by the battalion, and then some of the individual soldiers would want to actually bring them home. So these are actually the first adoptions from South Korea. They were kind of off the books, off the record. The soldiers who wanted to bring these kids home had to cut through a lot of red tape, find loopholes to bring the kids home. Social workers in the US were very skeptical about whether or not this was a good idea. Oftentimes the mascots would come and the soldiers were bachelors, so especially in the 50s, like, what? That doesn't make sense. So then the soldiers' parents would adopt the child. So this is the earliest. These are the earliest images and examples of Korean children being adopted after the war. And we've seen this picture already in Suji's presentation. So this is Harry Holt, who is famous for the adoption agency that bears his name, Holt International Children's Services. And that agency had its beginnings in Korea when Holt, who is an evangelical Christian, had a calling from God to save the mixed-race war orphans from Korea. So this, I believe, is from 1955. But what I wanted to point out is how different this image is from the very first image we saw of Dean Hess. First of all, they're mixed-race kids. Second of all, it's a civilian and not a military person. So you have, Holt, a civilian, in a nurturing yet fatherly role with mixed-race Koreans. So in this talk, I've outlined this kind of transformation from the first image to the second image. But what I'm going to focus on now is how we get from the second image to the third image. So how do we go from full, again, in scare quotes, full Korean children to mixed race to full Korean again? Because what ended up happening in the 60s is a shift from the mixed race, so-called crisis of mixed race children in Korea, to the full-on elaboration of what we know of as transnational Korean adoption, which was almost entirely full Korean children. So the last image is of World Vision's Enchanting Korean Orphan Choir, which some of you may remember. And I use this image in part because the 1960s, when this orphan choir was very active, they went to like 40 different nations around the world. They sang for the Pope, they sang at the Taj Mahal, they sang at the UN. They kind of were iconic of Korean children. So some of you may remember, well into the 1980s, people would refer to adoptees as Korean orphans, right? So, and a lot of that had to do with images like this, or productions like this, where Korean orphans were projected in this way for an international audience. Now, just an interesting side note, and I haven't verified this, but according to my father, at least by the late 60s, a lot of the Korean orphans in the choir were not actually orphans, because it became so famous that like middle-class Korean parents just wanted to get their kids into the orphan choir. So there's that as well. Okay, so as we've heard already, there were an estimated 100,000 children of mixed parentage. Oh, sorry, there's one more fun image of the Korean orphan choir. So you can see there were many, many albums, and a scholar here, Catherine Lee, is actually doing her research on the Korean orphan choir. So if any of you know anything about them, you should talk to her. So as has been mentioned, government estimates after the war were that there were 100,000 children of mixed parentage in South Korea. Many had been abandoned. There was a sense that these GI babies or UN babies would never fit into South Korea, and that and legally they were stateless because they lacked any proof of paternity, and their mothers were unable to register them legally in South Korea because of the misogynistic legal citizenship system at the time. And the notion was that they rightfully belonged in their father's homeland, which was often presumed to be the United States. So these notions were shared by Syngman Rhee, the first president of South Korea, and a lot of people within the US. And this shocking statement that Grace cited by Syngman Rhee, Pearl S. Buck actually gave a testimony to the US Congress about Amerasians, and she quotes Syngman Rhee saying, mixed race children must be removed, even if we have to drop them into the Pacific Ocean. But what I want to underscore here is that it's not only racism that motivated this kind of language, but also the ideological battle with North Korea over sovereign legitimacy. So during the Cold War and after the division, the question was, which government, the DPRK or the ROK, has the legitimate power to rule over all Korean people, right? So in this context, the appearance of these mixed race kids was proof for the communists, and North Korea in particular, that in fact, yes, the US had a colonial presence in South Korea, that South Korea was being controlled by the imperial US. So this was, I just want to underscore that removing the children was really considered to be a political necessity. And for the US side, it made the US look very humanitarian, right? Kind of welcoming an inclusive place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The other thing I want to say about this transformation is that when we get from Dean Holt, what we also see are two sides of the American military occupation of South Korea. Because in both images, American men are the redeemers of South Korea, but what meanings the American military presence has become very ambiguous, right? So on the one hand, they save children. On the other hand, they produce children and abandon them, right? So what are we supposed to do with that? And that ambiguity, I would argue, and I think other people would agree, has kind of persisted throughout the US-South Korea relationship. Has it been beneficial, or has it actually undermined the self-determination of South Korea and South Korean people? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, this chart may be too small, but I want to go very quickly through some of the numbers related to adoptions from South Korea to point out some of the patterns and trends that are noticeable. Can anyone read the numbers on here? It's like a eyesight exam. So in the 50s, there were about 2,900 children who left, and these are all documented. So the total, according to the Ministry of Health and Welfare in South Korea, is about 167,000 children, but most experts agree that it's much closer to 200,000, if not more, because not all the children, especially the mascots, were not documented. In the 60s, you have about 6,200. In the 70s, 46,000. How did that happen? By the 80s, it's 66,500. And then it starts going down a bit in the 1990s to 23,000, and then about 19,000 in the first 10 years of the 2000s, and then it's really kind of slowed down considerably since then. So what is this pattern about, and how do mixed-race Koreans fit into it? So this is just a chart showing the relative percentage of children who left Korea during each decade. And the period during which mixed-race children left was in this area, 50s and 60s, so 6%, roughly, of the total. So what's going on in the 70s and 80s? This is when adoptions really, really took off, and these were all so-called full Korean children. This is a chart that shows the different countries that adoptees went to. The vast majority, at least 75% or more, went to the US. And the dates when these adoption programs started. So interestingly, I mean, for the US, it's obvious. It started in 53, right after the end of the Korean War. But then you have France, 68. Why did it start in 68? Sweden, 57, that was a little earlier. Denmark, 65. Again, why are children leaving for Europe in the late 1960s? And then here's a chart that shows the percentage of mixed-race Koreans per decade. So in the beginning, in the 50s, they constituted the vast majority, 78%. By the 70s, they're down to a third. By the 70s, it's a trickle. It's tiny. And what we know, and what I'll say, is that by the mid-1950s, and certainly by the by the mid to late 1960s, there were almost no mixed-race Korean children in orphanages or being adopted. Okay, and this is just a chart showing the reasons given for the relinquishment of children. And in the beginning, it was mostly abandonment. And by the 70s, it also included broken homes, meaning usually divorce. And then by the mid-80s and late 1990s, it was almost all due to unwed mothers relinquishing children. So this is about the stigma of unwed motherhood. And this last chart shows, and it was mentioned earlier by Grace, the ways in which children were categorized as healthy or disabled, and mixed-race children were categorized as disabled is not the right term. It's actually not normal, which sounds terrible in English, but that's what they would say. And the gender ratio is also shifted over time, and I don't really have time to go into that, but maybe later on. And what I'll say and kind of underscore towards the end is that adoption in South Korea has never not known international adoption. And I don't think you can say that about any other country in the world. So if this nation has always had international adoption as a way to solve particular social welfare problems and needs. So right after the war, it was about war orphans. Then it was about mixed race kids. Then it was about homeless children, poor children, children of divorce. Then it was about women who had children out of wedlock, right? So at each stage, you can see how adoption filled in a particular gap, wherein the state, which even today provides among the OECD developed nations, among the lowest percentage of annual GDP goes towards social welfare services. So this is the broader sort of political economic context in which we need to understand adoption. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the sort of historical description. And as I mentioned earlier, and The Seed from the East is the book written by Bertha Holt, which was a kind of chronicle of how the Holt Adoption Agency started and how they themselves adopted their first 8 war orphans from South Korea in 1955. They got a huge amount of attention for this, in part because it was not permissible at the time to bring in 8 children. It was permissible to bring in 2 children per family, but they wanted to bring in 8. And so what they had to do was, and also we need to remember that this was at a time when immigration bans against Asians in particular were in place in the US, right? So how do you bring children from Asia, not just 2, but 8, and you need special legal dispensation. So they got permission, or they got support from their local senator who helped to pass the, what was called a bill for the relief of certain Korean war orphans. And it was introduced to the House of Representatives in 1955, and then an act, oh my goodness. Okay, so you're getting to get the really fast version now. Okay, so essentially they got this special act passed, which allowed them to bring in 6 additional children. And okay. So, but what I find really interesting about this particular period is Bertha herself wrote to Eisenhower because they were waiting for the bill to be passed and then the act to be legislated, and he needed to sign it. And so what she wrote to him was, every day these children wait in Korea, their lives are in jeopardy because these mixed blood children are very susceptible to the diseases that the Koreans have built up an immunity against over thousands of years. A drink of water, a bite of raw vegetable can bring death to them. Okay, so we have to put it in context. She really wanted the bill to be signed, like quickly, right? But she also was saying, like, their racial makeup makes them totally different from Koreans. So here you have a biological notion of race that I think most of us would reject at this point. But nevertheless, this notion was repeated in a local paper where they said, these little ones do not thrive well because they do not have the resistance to parasites and disease that full-blooded Koreans have. Also, they seem to need a different diet than Korean children get along on and do not thrive well in Korean orphanages. Just interesting, right? But also, we know that the mixed-race children in orphanages were subject to neglect and stigmatization. You know, it's impossible to really know whether they were biologically disposed to diseases, but you can see how certain racialized notions came into play about the difference of these kids and why they needed to be brought to the US. Another thing that was kind of underscored on the part of the South Koreans was that their racial difference could be used in the Cold War capitalist versus communist ideological battle. So there was a blonde-haired 3-year-old mixed-race boy named John Johan who had been adopted by a family in Missouri in 1956. And it was reported that he had been kidnapped by communists but rescued before they got him across the border. Because of his Occidental appearance, the communists reportedly wanted to use John for propaganda that Americans are colonizing South Korea. And so there's that piece. Another piece is the way in which the South Korean state, even as early as 1954, really thought about these kids as building economic and political bridges with the US. So Syngman Rhee writes to his diplomat in New York, we are most anxious to send as many of our orphans to the States as possible. In particular, we desire to have adopted those children of Western fathers and Korean mothers who can never hope to make a place for themselves in Korean society. Those children should appeal to Americans even more than Koreans. And the second quote is by this same official back to the president saying, there were certain meetings going on at the UN regarding whether or not countries with soldiers in particular countries should be responsible for the financial support of women and children they left behind. And he says, while these meetings go on and while we should be alert on what can be done through this for the benefit of our girls and their children, we shall also keep in mind the larger aspects of national interest, such as intercountry adoption and military aid we continue to receive and keep our diplomatic relations in proper attitude. So there's already a sense that these relationships could lead to greater benefits for the nation. And on the US side, similarly, this is a quote from Ebony magazine, which featured mixed race, mostly African American Korean children in orphanages. And here the quote is, for both political and humanitarian reasons, officials in the US State Department hope that these children will find homes in America. Their adoption will effectively counteract any drop in America's prestige in that part of the world. This language and this notion of children acting as bridges or ambassadors has continued well into the present. As adoption filled in certain social welfare gaps for South Korea, incorporating adoptees as these kinds of little ambassadors, or in the words of Catherine Moon, like intimate diplomats, has been continuous. So adoptees who go back now, they'll be like, oh, you're Korean and you're a bridge between East and West. And it's one can think of it as just a kind of post facto kind of compensation, but it was actually part of government policy in the 1980s in particular to integrate a notion of adoption as building these intimate relationships with citizens of other countries, particularly the West. Okay, I don't know how to spend the rest of the time, but this is a really interesting piece that you probably can't read it all because it's snow, but it's from an Oregon paper, and the author is actually like a pretty important figure in African American journalism, William Hilliard, who at this point was a very young reporter in a very racist industry, but who went on to become the editor of this paper, the only African American editor of this paper. But anyway, he was in Korea covering the Holts, and he's the only one I have found who actually interviewed and talked with a Korean birth mother, because every other article assumes that they're orphans or just makes no mention of the Korean mother. So here he, here he says, this is an article called Mothers of Mixed Bloods Have Hard Life in Korea. So this is a quote from his essay. Not all of the Korean children brought to America by farmer Harry Holt are real orphans. Many of them have been given up by their mothers, most of them reluctant to let their children go. These mothers are left behind to find a new life in Korea, for with their mixed blood children, they are outcasts. The act they have committed is an ignominious one. Wow, never said that word out loud. Many of them have turned to prostitution to make a living. Korean mothers of mixed blood children are a dolorous lot. I've never said that out loud either. Dolorous lot. Although many of them can blame themselves for their plight, a great many others can place the blame squarely on the shoulders of many deceitful foreign troops, and not all of them American. So this is a 24-year-old birth mother, and some of these birth mothers were not sex workers, but they worked as supporting staff for American or UN battalions, and she was one of them. Her name was Kim Soon-ja, and she relinquished her daughter for overseas adoption to Holt when Hilliard was interviewing her. She was married to an American serviceman by an army chaplain in Korea after she became pregnant. Her husband returned to the States in November 1955, and within a year told her that he was going to marry an American woman. Her parents, who lived in a distant city, did not know about her marriage or her child, and once her 11th-month-old baby became ill, she sought help from the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital, where Holt often located children for overseas adoption. And we even hear her voice. She's quoted as saying in non-standard English, "In Korea, it is very hard for mother of GI baby to live. People all time point finger at her. I must work, but it is hard to find a job. I have nothing left but my baby." Adoption of mixed-race children converted so quickly to total dominance of full Korean children in adoption. And what happened by the mid-1960s is that, and we heard about social workers going to Camptowns to find blonde-haired children and to convince their mothers to give them up in their best interests. But this was also a time when there were almost no mixed-race children in orphanages. Camptown mothers were deciding to keep their children for various reasons. A lot of social workers said, you're delusional, it's actually immoral for you to keep the child, it's going to be too old to be adopted after a certain point. But this was also a time where hundreds of marriage petitions were being filed by US military. So we know there are lots of military brides too, right? So it's a very mixed scene. We can't assume that women were just kind of delusional. They were calculating what is possible and what do I want. And so yes, there's a rise in international marriages. There were also programs trying to project a future Korea where Eurasian, as they called them, children could have a normal life. So there's this program called Éclair, started by Western social workers, called Eurasian Children Living as Indigenous Residents. So even in the mid-1960s, they were saying, this can't go on, right? This is an unsustainable situation. We can't just keep producing these children and then sending them abroad. How do we make a place for them in South Korea? Unfortunately, that program was defunded. It never really fully got off the ground. But the shift to full Korean children happened because it's been called goal displacement by some scholars, where once you had the institutions, and just to try to reduce the figures of child abandonment, but at the same time, no one really knew how many children were actually being abandoned. The numbers in orphanages didn't necessarily correlate with abandonment, because a lot of the orphanage directors would want to have children so that they could increase the numbers, because they would receive aid according to the number of children they had, even if they weren't orphans or even if they hadn't been relinquished. So that was the picture in the 1960s. I oftentimes wonder what would have happened if, because the 60s was such a crucial time, the mid-60s, right? The number of mixed-race children had really declined. Social welfare in South Korea was pretty much non-existent, but there were people thinking about what are possible indigenous solutions. So what might have happened if the state, the South Korean state, if international aid organizations, if other people had thought much more creatively about how to raise and keep Korean children in South Korea? I don't think we'll ever know, but unfortunately, those alternatives never really came to fruition. So instead, you have what I'm calling this kind of the permanent social welfare solution of transnational adoption, where during every decade, adoption filled in a gap, and as I mentioned before, the state would also make an argument about why it was actually a good thing for everyone. Not just in terms of upward mobility for the child, but a good thing for the nation in terms of receiving some kind of cultural, social, economic return on investment, if I could be so crude. So that's where I think I'll have to end, because I'm sure I'm well over time, but thank you for your patience.